Andrew Cuomo just made these comments that made my head explode. He's such a liar. He has tried to rebrand himself, just like his loser brother, as some sort of a moderate now. You know, he's like a fair and balanced Democrat. He's trying to reinvent himself and reinvent history and his behavior when it came to the COVID lockdowns. And on his podcast, he had CNN's favorite doctor, Leanna Wen, who never saw a lockdown she didn't like or a mask or a vaccine mandate. And they're going over, you know, how reasonable they both were during the pandemic. And he drops this on it. I lived in New York for the entire pandemic, right? It's one of the reasons we left and came to Connecticut, his overreach. But I lived in New York. Everything, as it turns out, I know you did too, Matt. Everything, as it turns out, it was all voluntary. None of it was mandatory. Okay, all those businesses, they didn't need to close. The schools, that wasn't thanks to him. The mask mandates, not his doing. He was just this sort of gentle idea suggester at the top. Listen to this in SOT 14.
Government had no capacity to enforce any of this. You must wear a mask. And people wore masks in New York. But if they said, I'm not wearing a mask, there was nothing I could do about it. You must close your private business. I won't. Well, there was nothing I could really do about it. It was really all voluntary, and it was extraordinary when you think about it, that society acted with that uniformity voluntarily.
Oh my God. Can I just tell you one quick story? Just one quick story. So I have a very dear friend who is a single mom who had a dance studio and a company in Manhattan. And she was making it. She really was making it. She had a lot of young girls who were loving her instruction, and they performed at the UN. They performed overseas. Like, she was getting a bunch of gigs for these young girls. One of them went off to Princeton, I think it was. Another one got cast in a Scorsese movie. Like, they were making it. And everything was shut down because of him, because of this man. And it wasn't just my friend. It was a lot of people. This is just one industry. We could go through any one of them. But the dance industry, for one. You weren't allowed to dance during COVID. Couldn't offer in New York State, New York City. You couldn't have a dance studio. It wasn't allowed. And I actually went back and just pulled the New York Times article on some of the complaints in that particular industry, just as one example. And it was talking about how frustrating the existing guidelines were, that they seemed to conflate dance studios with gyms, and gyms had a much longer period in which they were not allowed to open at all, but dance studios were also ordered closed for a period. One studio owner received clearance to reopen from the Department of Health. Another called the Department of Health and was told she could not open her dance studio. Another reopened and was shut down by the city sheriff's office. So what would happen, Andrew Cuomo, if anybody tried to defy your executive orders? Was the sheriff would show up. People were not free to disregard your vaccine, mask, or business or school closure mandates. They had to comply. It was not some miraculous hand-holding, let's unify and bow down to the dear leader in Albany moment. And the nerve, Matt, to suggest otherwise on camera, on the record.
He, in August of 2021, right? This is the guy who made his nut in the spring of the pandemic, somehow became the love gov, and everyone was really interested in what he had to say, and he was calming and soothing. He was portrayed as sort of the anti-Trump, or the counterpart to Trump. And so, if we're going to follow the science, we're always going to follow the science, right? Remember that. August of 2021, he was warning that if we open up schools, public schools again, that they might become a super spreader event. We had a lot of science in between March of 2020 and August of 2021. We had a lot of examples all around the world of what happens when you open up schools. And it turns out what happens is then the schools are open and the kids can learn, and they're not going to based in their own dysfunction and social isolation, and have a lot of problems that have, among other things, driven a whole lot of people away from the public school system in the city of New York, like me. Now I'm paying way too much money for private schools for my daughter. It's a separate story, maybe, but it's all kind of related. It's ridiculous, this sense of revisionism, and we're going to see a lot of it because none of that's popular. Gavin Newsom, right? He's the one who said, like, we're going to look back and we're going to see and where we went wrong. And now that we know a lot more, I actually appreciate the gesture, but I want him to know, and everybody else, that doesn't mean that we're going to forget that you put yellow tape on outdoor playgrounds in California in December of 2020, which is absolutely insane, is so counterproductive to every public health thing that we know. So both of those characters, New York has a special sauce in which, because of progressive era, like meaning 20s and 30s, governance reforms, no one knows who's in charge of anything, right? Somehow the governor is in charge of the subways in New York City. It's just like, it's all like weird and doesn't make sense. There's these quasi-governmental authorities like the Port Authority. So I'm sure he could hide behind like, well, it wasn't me who could enforce this particular mask mandate. It was actually the city. But if you're a resident of New York, all you know is that government's around you at all times. A health inspector can come at any minute and close down your business for any reason. You're aware of it. You follow the law or the threat of the law. And what that meant in New York was really severe lockdowns, way too severe lockdowns. And we're still climbing out of that. And it's going to take a long time for us to.
Yeah, we've been covering what happened with the church out in California. David Zweig's been doing great reporting on this, that held services, notwithstanding the lockdowns there and the mandates there. And the FBI infiltrated the church. And now that church has been forced to pay all these fines pursuant to their state policy. There are enforcement mechanisms. He's lying. He's full of shit. This was not voluntary. People were forced to go along with it by state health authorities and at some level, federal authorities. I pulled some of the New York Times background on this just because we all lived it. And here's a New York Times piece. In recent weeks, the governor has repeatedly made it clear that he believed he had no choice but to seize more control over pandemic policy from state and local public health officials, and because he didn't think they understood how to force people to comply. Here's another one. State health officials said they often found out about major changes in pandemic policy only after Governor Cuomo announced them at news conferences and then asked them to match their health guidance to the announcements. So that's what would happen. Then the state health authorities would issue these mandates or, quote, guidelines that the schools felt that they had no choice but to comply with, that businesses had to comply with, and then in some cases, law enforcement would run around enforcing on everybody, Emily. And here's one more. Here's one more before you comment on it. I would be remiss if I did not mention my dear friend Janice Dean's, reason for being over the past 3 years. And that is what he did with the nursing homes. He issued an order on March 25th, 2020, that all New York State nursing homes must accept residents that are medically stable. And it stated, quote, no resident shall be denied readmission or admission to nursing homes because they tested positive or were suspected to have COVID. What it essentially did was render testing of incoming patients inappropriate. And therefore, patients who were COVID positive were put into the nursing homes by the thousand. And it led to some 10 to 15,000 deaths of the most vulnerable elderly populations inside these nursing homes. He then went on to lie about the number who died because he knew he had blood on his hands and he didn't want the responsibility. All of this is backed up by the Democrat Attorney General, Letitia James. He gave the order. He gave the order. It wasn't voluntary. People are dead because of what he did. And I'm sorry, I realize COVID's over. They're trying to bring it back, but it's over. But accountability is important, and calling out these lies is important.
It's one of the clearest cut examples from the pandemic of a policy that, as you pointed out, was an order, not a voluntary suggestion leading to deaths. You can connect A and B more clearly with Andrew Cuomo than almost this specific policy decision, more clearly than almost any others. It is really the perfect example of COVID evil and incompetence. And on the incompetence point, first of all, the man wrote a book that celebrated his legacy during COVID as the media was celebrating his legacy during COVID. He got taken down by Me Too stuff, not by his gross mismanagement that actually led to deaths during COVID. He wrote a book because the media allowed him to get away with mismanaging COVID because the media was reporting bad information. They were ideologically driven throughout the pandemic. And again, does a governor get away with having a policy like that is actually having life and death consequences for as long as he did without a complicit and incompetent and ideologically compromised media? Absolutely not. So did Andrew Cuomo absolutely lead to life and death consequences? Yes. Did the media's enabling of Andrew Cuomo also have life and death consequences? Absolutely yes. Looking straight at CNN, by the way, who allowed him to get away with all of this stuff, but so did everyone else. I am fascinated by how what he's saying now is probably in conflict with his own book. He is telling the story. And again, they will let him get away with it. He will get away with it. There's no question about it. And that's why he feels comfortable doing it. And that is why the media's idiocy has, again, real life or death consequences. It's not just this abstract conversation about fake news. It actually, like the bigger conversation is that Andrew Cuomo shouldn't be able to show his face in polite society without apologizing and explaining why his voice still is relevant and legitimate because he learned from the pandemic and made all of these major mistakes. Why should we trust you or care what you say unless you are groveling and saying what you did wrong?
This is a flash sale event for EnviroCleanse, the home air purifier so powerful the U.S. Navy chose it to purify the air on their ships. The timing of this 25% off flash sale could not be better. It is officially cold and flu season, and of course, it's the 10,000th variety of COVID coming out soon. EnviroCleanse is proven to capture and destroy flu and COVID viruses in your home, not to mention bacteria, toxins, mold, and allergens. We found mold at our beach house. Guess what they said? Get some air purifiers right now before you can get it taken care of at a more macro level. EnviroCleanse is a way you can fight back against the entire family getting sick. In fact, EnviroCleanse is the only home air purifier that promises you and your family better health. Don't miss this 25% off flash sale, 25% off. Order your EnviroCleanse home air purifier while supplies last. Visit ekpure.com and use the code Megyn. ekpure.com, code Megyn, ekpure.com, code Megyn. Hey, thanks so much for watching. If you like what you just saw, hit the subscribe button for more clips and full episodes.